Something significant has been happening behind closed doors, and most investors have no idea it even took place. 5 separate meetings, 5 conversations between two of the most powerful financial institutions influencing Iraq's economic future. The International Monetary Fund and the Central Bank of Iraq have been talking, and what they agreed on, quietly, carefully, without much fanfare, may be the most important development IQD holders have seen in years. So before you make any decisions about your position, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what was discussed, what it means for Iraq's economy, and what it could signal for the Iraqi dinar going forward. What if the meetings that seemed routine on the surface were actually laying the groundwork for something much larger? That is the question experienced IQD analysts are asking right now. Not out of speculation, but because the pattern of these engagements, the timing, and the specific topics on the table tell a story that deserves serious attention. Why are seasoned diner holders paying close attention to this? Because in the world of currency reform, the real signals rarely come with a press release. They come in the form of institutional coordination. And that is precisely what we are seeing unfold. Let's start with the foundation of what we know. Over the past several months, the IMF and the Central Bank of Iraq engaged in 5 documented rounds of consultation. Now, to some, that might sound like bureaucratic routine, but here's why it matters. The IMF does not invest this level of repeated engagement with a central bank unless serious structural discussions are underway. Historically, when the IMF increases the frequency of its consultations with a developing nation's central bank, it is a leading indicator of monetary policy alignment, meaning both institutions are working toward shared financial targets. For Iraq, this is not the first time such coordination has occurred. Back in the period following the 2003 reconstruction, IMF involvement was directly tied to the stabilization of the dinar and the establishment of currency reserves. The pattern is recognizable to anyone who studies this space carefully. But that's only part of the story. What were they actually discussing? Based on official statements and financial disclosures, the meetings covered 3 core areas: exchange rate stability, foreign reserve management, and Iraq's path toward broader financial integration with global markets. Each of these topics is individually significant. Together, they form a picture of a country actively working to modernize its monetary framework. Exchange rate stability, in particular, is worth slowing down on. The CBI has maintained a pegged rate for years, but the method and mechanics of how that peg is managed is quietly evolving. The introduction of new dollar auction mechanisms, the crackdown on currency manipulation, and the shift towards more transparent foreign exchange operations, these are all connected threads in a larger reform story. Here's what many investors are overlooking. The foreign reserve question is critical. Iraq's oil revenues have continued to generate substantial dollar inflows, and the CBI has been actively managing how those reserves are held, diversified, and deployed. In the IMF discussions, reserve adequacy, meaning whether Iraq holds enough in reserve to support its currency at a given rate, was a central theme. This matters enormously for IQD holders because reserve adequacy is one of the technical prerequisites that international financial bodies look for before any significant exchange rate adjustment can be considered sustainable. Iraq is not starting from zero here. Reserves have grown. The question the IMF is helping the CBI answer is whether the infrastructure around those reserves is strong enough to support the next stage of Iraq's financial evolution. Now let's talk about the economic reform dimension, because this is where the story gets even more layered. Iraq has been under significant pressure, both internally and from international partners, to reduce its dependence on oil as the singular driver of government revenue. The IMF has been explicit in its recommendations: diversify, formalize the non-oil economy, expand the tax base, and reduce the subsidy burden on the national budget. These are not comfortable reforms. They require political will, and Iraq's political environment is notoriously complex. But here's what is quietly shifting. The current government has demonstrated a more consistent commitment to reform implementation than previous administrations. White paper economic reforms initially launched in 2020 have seen renewed momentum, and the IMF has acknowledged this progress in its most recent Article 4 consultation report, which is significant because IMF acknowledgement of reform progress is not symbolic. It has real implications for Iraq's credit standing and its relationships with multilateral financial institutions. The next point could be even more important than what I just told you. Oil market dynamics are playing a role in this story that cannot be ignored. Iraq remains OPEC's second largest producer, and global oil prices directly influence the fiscal space the Iraqi government has to operate within. When oil prices are elevated, Iraq generates surplus revenues that can be channeled into stabilization funds and reserve buffers. When prices fall, pressure on the budget increases and currency defense becomes more expensive. Right now, the global oil market is navigating a complex environment. Supply management decisions by OPEC+, geopolitical variables, and shifting demand projections from major economies. The CBI and the IMF are factoring all of this into their exchange rate framework. For IQD holders, this means the macroeconomic environment surrounding Iraq is not static. It is actively being managed, and managed with more sophistication than many outside observers give it credit for. This detail may change how you view everything else discussed today. The global financial dimension of these talks is something rarely covered in IQD analysis, but it belongs in this conversation. Iraq has been working towards greater integration with international payment systems, correspondent banking relationships, and eventually the kind of financial credibility that attracts foreign direct investment at scale. The IMF's role in this process is that of a credibility guarantor. When the IMF publicly engages with a country's central bank at this level and frequency, it sends a signal to global financial markets. This institution is being held to international standards, and it is meeting the challenge. That reputational dimension has compounding effects over time. It builds the kind of institutional trust that precedes major economic transitions. So, what does all of this mean for Iraqi dinar holders? Let's be clear about what we know and what remains uncertain, because intellectual honesty is what separates serious analysis from noise. What we know is this: Iraq's monetary authorities are engaged in sustained, structured dialogue with the world's most influential financial institution. The topics under discussion, reserve management, exchange rate frameworks, economic diversification, are precisely the building blocks of a stronger currency environment. The reform trajectory, while imperfect and nonlinear, is moving in a direction that international institutions are publicly acknowledging as progress. What remains uncertain is the timeline. Currency reform of this nature doesn't happen on a schedule that outside investors can predict with precision. It happens when institutional readiness meets political will, meets macroeconomic conditions, and those three variables do not always align on command. What experienced IQD analysts understand is that the process matters as much as the outcome, and right now the process is showing signs of meaningful advancement. Here's the balanced takeaway. 5 IMF-CBI meetings are not a guarantee of any specific outcome, but they are not nothing. They represent a level of institutional engagement that historically preceded structural shifts in how Iraqi's currency is positioned on the global stage. For investors in this space, the intelligent response is not euphoria, and it is not dismissal. It is informed patience, continuing to monitor the signals, understanding the framework, and staying close to credible analysis as developments unfold. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is happening behind the scenes with the Iraqi dinar, then do this one thing right now. Hit the like button, because it tells us this kind of in-depth analysis is valuable to you. Subscribe if you have not already, because we cover these developments consistently and carefully. No hype, no empty promises, just serious analysis for serious investors. Share this video with anyone in the IQD community who deserves to understand what these IMF-CBI meetings actually mean. And turn on notifications, because in this space, timing and information are everything. We'll see you in the next video.